Good morning, everybody. So, as mentioned, I'm Jared Mallandane, and I form part of the business development team of Online Intelligence. So, before I go into any detail of the presentation itself, I first want to give you a bit of background on Online and how do we fit within this environment that we'll be discussing today. So, Online Intelligence, we are a software development house that focuses on enterprise risk solutions. Now, that could be from alarm monitoring to occurrence book, incident reporting, investigation and case management. And basically, we are currently the leading supplier of enterprise risk solutions across Africa at this moment. As any growing company, our goal would obviously become the global leader in enterprise risk solutions as well. So we are incredibly privileged to be involved in a number of industries, whether it be mining, logistics, whatever it could be, we are involved somewhere along the line. We are very privileged to have over 240 clients in over 38 countries within these industries themselves as well. Our head office is in Pretoria, and our regional office is in Stellenbosch. So now you know where I come from and what the company I represent. Now, before I jump into the full presentation and the theory of the presentation itself, I would like to make a statement in saying that risk is everywhere. Ultimately, whatever we do, driving here this morning, there was risk involved in that. We could have been involved in an accident. Me standing here today in front of you, I could make an idiot of myself. There's a risk in that process. So, ultimately, the element we have to understand, wherever we go, we have risk. We need to understand how do we mitigate that risk. And how do we prevent that risk from impacting us and our businesses? As a business, all of us want to succeed. We want to grow. We want to see our bottom line increase. So how do we prevent that how do we prevent risk from stopping that, ultimately? So I'm now going to jump into a bit of a definition, just so we're all working on the same platform. We all understand, what the risk management element that I'm talking about is. So the first definition I'd like to focus on is what is operational risk as defined by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. Now, they define it as the risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people, and systems, or from external events. Okay, so in that regard, what then is risk management? So risk management, as defined by the Institute of Risk Management, then involves understanding, analyzing and addressing risk to make sure organizations achieve their objectives. So it must be proportionate to the complexity and type of organization involved. So out of these definitions, we can then pull key elements that help us to understand operational risk management. So what are those key elements that we have to focus on? Now, those key elements are all interlinked, and you'll see that throughout the presentation. The first one, we have to understand our goal. What is our goal that we are trying to achieve? As a business, whether it's trying to achieve success and bottom line success, is it to purely mitigate the risk of your downtime within an environment? What is your risk? What are we actually trying to achieve? The reason that is so important, that is the only way we can actually measure whether the strategies we're putting in place are having an impact, ultimately. Your second element is understanding the potential risks involved with that goal. So what is going to prevent you or potentially prevent you from achieving and reaching that goal? In understanding that potential risk as well, we also have to understand what is our risk appetite. Now, there's multiple ways we can work out risk appetite, and I'm not going to go into the definitions of that, but purely a base definition of what is our appetite for risk. What are we prepared to accept? If it's an armed response company, the risk that you possibly have is somebody dying if you don't respond quickly enough. Can that be recovered? No. Do we have a risk appetite for death within that environment? No. However, a financial environment, if our pure risk is financially orientated, can we recover the finance? Yes, we can. So ultimately, we have to accept that risk, and we have to accept the risk appetite in order to help us succeed ultimately, to develop a strategy to prevent that. Okay. The third element, we have to understand our data sources. Now, all the presentations that we had previously were perfectly aligned to this point. There's a mass amount of data in this world. We're all in the fourth industrial revolution. Now, what do we actually do with the data? And that's the challenge. We have to understand the value of our data in context to the potential risk and in context to our goal. ultimately. If we don't understand that data, we are putting ourselves in a position to generate white noise, where we have fantastic amounts of data, but what is the data actually telling us at the end of the day? And the last element is understanding your internal process. Now, those internal processes, that could be standard operating procedures, service level agreements, code of conducts, anything that assists us in governing what we are actually doing as part of our risk mitigation strategy, in essence. Now, these processes and all these elements have to work hand in hand together. Now, the title of this presentation is The Value of an Integrated Approach to Operational Risk Management. And that's where these elements come in together, is because they affect each other, and they affect each other in multiple ways. So, if we look at these elements in isolation, what do we see? We have our goals, we have our data sources, our potential risks, and our internal processes. None of them are talking to each other. So ultimately what you have is you might have a mass amount of data, you might have brilliant processes. But if that data is not influencing your process, is it really giving you benefit within your environment? So if we then, what we tend to happen, we have a static risk mitigation approach, where ultimately you either become very proactive, where you're trying to prevent absolutely everything under the sun, which is, as we know, as we heard today, is not possible, or you become incredibly reactive, where your pure response is, when the event takes place, we'll figure it out, ultimately. So, if we look at an integrated approach, what we see is all these elements start linking into each other. So, our potential risk is linked to our goal, our data sources are influencing our processes are influencing our goal again, and it becomes a cycle. All that information that we are generating starts feeding off each other and pushing the information back into a specific process. What ultimately then starts happening, we have adaptable risk mitigation. So you now have the ability to understand your processes and understand your data sources and allow them to help you figure out a process in that. Okay, now, just as a bit of definition again, what are the differences between the proactive and a reactive approach, and then a combined approach? So, a proactive approach, if you're looking from a static perspective, is the pure adage is prevention is better than cure. We try to reduce the possibility of a risk event taking place. Now, while we heard this morning, that is fantastic, it's impossible to plan for absolutely everything. So you become static and you become very future orientated, where you are trying to prevent everything. If you look at a pure reactive approach, you're responding to a risk event. That is ultimately you saying, when it takes place, we've got a process, we'll figure it out, and if not, we'll try and adapt the process as we can. So that becomes a very here and now orientated approach. Now, what an integrated view allows you to do, by integrating those elements together, it allows us to go into a combined risk approach. Now, what is a combined risk approach? It's where we find that perfect balance between the preventative measures and the reactive measures, ultimately, for our risk management strategy. And that's how you get adaptable risk management, ultimately. So, the benefit we also have with this is it is applicable to multiple industries. So it's not only something to apply to a security company or to apply to a logistics company. The benefit is in understanding those key elements, we can apply those key elements to your specific circumstance to fit your environment. So as that first definition said, we have to have a risk management is understanding your exact problem that you need to face and have your objective and understand it fitting in your environment specifically itself. Okay, so a basic example. If we look at the isolated approach within a logistics firm has a goal of ensuring safety of an asset from destination A to destination B. Their potential risk they can follow, or they need to be aware of, is hijacking. Let's be honest, within South Africa, it's a very high risk at this point. You have your internal processes purely to keep eyes on the vehicle. You have data sources and telematics and tracking. If we're looking within the isolated process, none of those elements are ultimately talking to each other. So while you might have data in telematics and tracking, you cannot possibly watch a vehicle where it is going consistently for 24 hours on the route. It is not possible to manage that. So what you end up facing is the internal processes do not speak back to mitigating the exact risk of hand, which is trying to avoid a hijacked vehicle, ultimately. And your data sources become unfocused and indirect. Because you have mass data, you start creating white noise for yourself. Yes, it's lovely to know where my vehicle is at any given moment, but what is it telling me? What is it telling me in relation to the fact that I need to prevent a hijacking on a specific vehicle? If we look at that from an integrated approach, what we then find is all of our elements start linking into each other. By now adding an additional process on top, now not only focusing on keeping eyes on the vehicle, but planning and looking for potential hijacking hotspots that we have from another data source, and combining a data source into a different process, we now get an overall picture where we can start monitoring that risk from a preventative and a reactive process. So it becomes, you start getting that balance that we're looking for in that combined approach. So you start moving away from that static approach of trying to respond when that hijacking took place, and you're actually looking at how to, potential ways to prevent that hijacking, as well as having the keys in place to react if you need to in that process. So how does this actually work in a practical way that online intelligence has linked with Geotab? So online intelligence and Geotab have been partners for a number of years, and we are privileged to have very similar verticals and very similar clients. Now, one of the core areas that we had was armed response, where Geotab has mass amounts of data with regards to where vehicles are, where armed response vehicles are. They have ability to start geofencing environments and have, to see where all those vehicles are at any given moment. In online intelligence, we have the ability to generate alarms and to see those alarms and manage those events within our applications. So by combining multiple processes and linking those two elements together, we were able to develop a first responder solution. Now, what that first responder solution does is, because the Geotab device is giving us a constant pull on its GPS coordinates, we have the ability, as that alarm has been allocated and is linked onto the stack, you can immediately dispatch a vehicle automatically by knowing the closest vehicle to that event. So taking into account now the time that that vehicle will take to get to that specific alarm, ultimately mitigating your risk. Now, if we look at that risk, is a delay in response from an armed response company resulting in loss, whether that loss is from an asset or whether that loss is related to life. Ultimately, we have to prevent that. So by combining all these different data sets and data sources of information together, we now have a solution that we can put down to market that automatically, as soon as an event is triggered, we can dispatch a vehicle. We can now communicate back to the control room itself. It's taking away the errors and it's taking away the human elements of saying which vehicle will be there closest. It's now using technology, and it's using an integrated process to automate that process for you, ultimately. So what you then have is the internal processes start speaking back to mitigating your exact risk at hand. Your data sources then become focused and direct, because now you can start seeing, if you do suffer loss during this process, what do we need to change? Is it an internal process that we need to change, or is it the data that we are receiving that we ultimately need to change in this process? You also then have the ability to start linking multiple processes to your specific risk management strategy itself as well. So now you can start linking your driver behavior into it. You can start linking if a vehicle has driven out of a geofenced area, and how will that impact if an alarm does have to take place. So you start finding that balance again between preventative and reactive, ultimately. So in conclusion, what we have is, through integrating these key elements, we are able to establish a full risk management strategy. The risk management strategy can then guide the balance between a proactive and a reactive approach. This allows us to enter into adaptable risk mitigation, where we are working from a fluid environment instead of the generic static that we are all used to, ultimately. Thank you.